Hi, and welcome to Euroscopic, a podcast brief about less obvious issues of import, European-based, globally focused. I'm William Bluecroft.
And this is Martin Gak.
This episode was recorded on Thursday, July 20th, 2023.
Hi, Martin.
Hello.
Hey.
So, a lot to talk about, really.
Definitely start with the lion thing. I mean, it's fun. It's stupid and fun.
Yeah, sure. I'm
sure by the time this podcast is posted, we're going to have a lot more answers. We'll know where the lion or the lioness is. But at the point of this recording, this is the big story gripping the center of Europe in Berlin.
An entire police section of the Berlin police chasing an apparent lioness.
We don't even know if it really is a lion, but apparently the last thing I read was the police have made a sighting of said lion. They don't know where it's come from or where it's going, or if it had a fight with a wild boar. Berlin has,
yes.
For being a city, Berlin has quite a few run-ins with wild animals. The famous story a couple of years ago was that wild boar stealing an overweight naked man's laptop at a lake in Berlin, and that made quite a fun summer story.
And this seems to be actually a phenomenon happening around Europe, that there is a return of wilderness, if not to wilderness, certainly of wilderness. Italy has seen actually new attacks of bears, which had been essentially extinct or had been gone for the better part of 2 centuries, or a century and a half.
Sort of the run-in of human development and wild animals, as we just keep expanding and expanding and expanding and growing and growing and growing. It has climate and ecological and biodiversity impacts, which again, I don't think this lion, whenever we figure out where it's come from and what the situation is quite so much that story. But it does bring to mind, as you say, this kind of run-in between wildlife and humans.
It's very clear that we are in the middle of what the Germans call the Sommerloch, the summer lull.
The doldrums.
Exactly. So, they're really just latching to any story that might pop up. Meanwhile, of course, we sit directly in front of a coming wave of far-right politics across Europe. We just had 2 major political moves that took place in Brussels over the last, really just 6 days. One was the signature of a deal with Tunisia, which is actually meant to be extended through the Maghreb. We covered this
pretty
briefly.
Shocking, this story.
It was actually, the EU has offered now 1 billion euros to Tunis to take care of controlling migration flow into Europe. It's really a remarkable amount of money for a country that is in array with very high levels of corruption, not to mention a dismal record of human rights. Actually put into question, pretty much every claim that Europe likes to make about itself and its values.
Well, of course, values for whom, right? We can go back a few months to when the EU's de facto, top diplomat, Josep Borrell, made that beautiful comment about, protecting the garden from the savage jungle outside, which he tried to walk back to try to not make it sound like the colonial, imperial, racist comment that it actually was. But of course, it's not great to be comparing, Europe to the garden and the rest of the world to the jungle.
You made the point that, as I was bemoaning the fact that the deal with the Tunisians is essentially the upper hand of the far right in countries like Italy and in countries like Hungary, in the international policy line of the EU, because essentially what they're doing now is outsourcing repression, torture, and border control,
right.
Which is something that the Europeans wouldn't want to have their hands dirty with. But it's very clear that, as Turkey did at its time, and Libya, did under the auspices of European money, they have absolutely no qualms about that. Now, the thing that you pointed out, and I think I take fully to heart, is that was actually Libya and Turkey happened under the watchful eye of the very upright Merkel, Hollande, Macron, really the first Macron period. So I think that what we're seeing in a way is really just the European center is essentially taking the opportunity of having, a bunch of far-right post-fascist parties, I mean, particularly the case of Fratelli d'Italia, which is quite literally that, to basically, in my understanding, have somebody to pin the blame on for what is going to probably happen in Tunis and in the Mediterranean.
I mean, the far right, the rise of the far right over the last decade, let's say, it really is a gift to the so-called center of European politics, because it is just a way to export, to put all of your own biases and bigotries and racist thoughts onto the other, those baddies. But really, they're saying the quiet part out loud.
That bad part, which is being said out loud, it's not being just said by sort of coalition governments, which are composed of like good center right and good center left in capital city. I mean, a lot of this is actually being discussed by the left. I mean, the left, people like Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, people like the Gilets Jaunes, which actually many of them came from the left, are people that have a very strong position on first labor protectionism, and then issues concerning protectionism at large, including cultural protectionism, that completely jibes with the sort of discourse of keep them away from the gates. The 10% mark of far-right parties is something that is very stable until you have the kind of bad weather, bad political and economic weather that will make a sizable portion of the left coalesce on agenda items such as, the need of more infrastructure, the need of better care, the need of a stronger presence of the state.
The political spectrum is just a circle. It just meets back up at the other end. I mean, as you've pointed out, there's in some policy areas, there's very little difference between the left and the right. And that's certainly not just a European phenomenon. You see that in the United States. I mean, it is not a surprise that so many, Trump supporters had a lot of sympathies for Bernie Sanders and vice versa. And it's not a surprise that in 2016, the two most popular candidates were neither really a Republican or a Democrat.
My perception, having been, involved in essentially professionally observing this process across really quite a few countries. I mean, Latin America, I come from Argentina, where I have seen massive swings, wild swings. In general, I think that the political spectrum is a sort of spectrum, and it is somewhat stable. I think that the problem, however, is that it's fluid, and people tend to forget this, which is the story of how, large sections of the voting public of Tuscany, which is traditionally a communist heartland, went Salvini during the previous election. And a lot of it was actually coming out of communist centers and communist associations, which were actually completely convinced that, Nigerians were taking their jobs and so on and so forth. This is actually really quite remarkable, because many of the people that were communists that voted for Salvini were people that, I know some of them who were swearing 15 years ago, were swearing on their parents, or their, partisan parents' graves, that they would never actually give a single vote ever to the Lega, any Lega. And there you have them, right? 15 years later. It is simply the case that we have actually a point of friction between incoming populations and established populations. And not a small part of that is essentially what has become a struggle for resources. I mean, in Germany, as far as I'm concerned, the culprit of the emergence of the AfD is not Merkel herself, which, I think it's more of I think of her as more of a spiritual guide. But I think that it was Schäuble. Schäuble was the finance minister who actually, with massive surplus, a surplus that was actually breaking the European Union's rules on surplus, still refused to disburse money to actually build infrastructure. I mean, you have to keep in mind, and for those who are listening to us who do not know, You have entire areas of Saxony, entire areas of Saxon-Anhalt, entire areas of of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which is the state to the north against Poland, which are completely and thoroughly underserved by the state.
I mean, if you just take a look at the rail map of Deutsche Bahn, and we can spend a whole podcast talking about the failures of the German National Rail Company, but for the purposes of this point, you see what used to be West Germany covered in rails, in rail networks, and you get to the east. The further you get east, it gets sparser and sparser and sparser and sparser. And then you wonder why people feel isolated and why people can't get to cities and can't connect with people. And there's no real excuse for being an outright racist. And as to use your example, to hate on the Nigerians for stealing their jobs, that you can see where that becomes a slippery slope. And there's this sense, not only a sense, but in some ways, very real deficit of resources and deficit of infrastructure. When, as you rightly point out, it's not like Germany's lacking the money to invest in its infrastructure.
Well, this is a perverse side of it, right? I mean, it's not that they couldn't stop the emergence of a far right, which actually had, as in every other case, sort of a desperate search for a populist niche that they could pull on, which was obviously going to be 90% of the times essentially economic disenfranchisement. It's a lot to do with the Blairite, Clintonite tradition that then produced things like, Zapatero, and produced things like Schröder with his reforms, and in France produced people like Hollande, whose economic minister was Macron, pushing some of the reforms that he had proposed and couldn't. He pushed them now. People that are traditional voters for the left that will tell you things like no hospital beds for my parents, no school for my kids, no aid from the state. And then when I turn to politics on the left, they tell me that I really should be discussing pronouns. Yeah, I understand that you don't have food to eat, but first let's settle the issue of whether you're a he or she. Obviously, I mean, in that kind of context, what you have is not just sort of a completely skewed sense of priorities, which then, if you want, like Hillary Clinton, you can cover by shouting, the deplorables at your own risk, at your own political risk.
Libya, one or the other.
Or bomb Libya in order to actually produce a more general sense of, cohesion, which Germany, of course, would not do. France does it every so often, but not at regular intervals like the US. The point here is that you're not only offering a askew set of political priorities, what you're also doing is essentially telling these people that your potential voters, that they are now political orphans. To the voter in Saxony, to the voter in Nantes, to the voter in Andalusia, to the voter in the middle of Denmark, Sweden, or Finland, which also has now actually far-right party in government, this is absolutely exotic, has absolutely no relation with their political immediate needs. Over many years, this has produced exactly what we're seeing now. People that think, well, this is the only sensible alternative to find a conduit for my political concerns.
People might be wondering, why are we talking about things that are decades past for what's ostensibly supposed to be about what's going on this week? But these things never leave us. There are stories this week that harken back to those times. I mean, I thought it was very funny to see a report come out in Germany from a medical association thinking, hey, with climate change, with things getting hotter, maybe it's actually a good idea to adopt the siesta-like culture that we see in Southern Europe,
right.
Also here in Germany. And you had Karl Lauterbach, the health minister, latch onto this idea and say, yeah, this is a good idea. Well, 10, 20 years ago when Schäuble was in power, he was one of the main voices that really stoked this idea of the lazy Southern European during the financial crisis, during the debt crisis,
Absolutely.
that they had to, do away with their pensions. They had to do away with a lot of their social welfare system. They had to work harder. They had to work longer, like the so-called productive Northern Europeans and certainly the Germans. And here we are, what Germany didn't learn from the financial crisis, we're learning here now from the climate crisis, which, maybe taking a break in the middle of the day is not the worst idea. And that just came out this week. I just found that such an interesting turn of fates.
I mean, I will say that as a lazy Southerner who gets actually a slight tan, I can absolutely thoroughly endorse the siesta. I would actually invite all our listeners to actually try it. The issue here is not paying back. The issue here is debt maintenance. how do we make a debt that we can maintain? Greece could not maintain the debt, could not actually service the debt as it was presented. Because obviously what you want is not somebody to give you a bunch of cash and then you spend it over the next couple of days in booze and cookies. I mean, what you want is somebody to be latching onto your system with a subscription. And that's exactly what a debt servicing system is. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because 10 years later, what we have is basically these same systems of austerity, discourse of austerity, discourse of laziness and productivity has essentially, in my calculation in any case, has essentially sort of given fruit to a new wave of far-right political parties, which was, well, if these people are going to treat you like lowlifes, if the political system is going to go along with the argument coming out of Paris and Berlin that you are essentially lazy bastards that cannot get away from the Uso bottle, then we're going to give you a political home and we're going to use this political force in whatever way we see fit. This is actually happening across Europe. This is the story with Fratelli d'Italia. This is the story with Vox, which will probably be part of the next Spanish government because the PP cannot govern by itself. So they will need to go into coalition, and they will probably take as a minority partner Vox, which is essentially a fascist party. So this is, I think, to a large degree, the product of that historical arc.
It's such a fantastical lack of responsibility and lack of accountability. From mainstream parties, center left, center right, these parties that have dominated the post-war period, not taking account of things that did not go so well in their perfect idea of this sort of market-driven liberal world that we live in. And then, rather than taking stock when these far-right parties start popping up, thinking, oh, maybe there's a reason that there's so much resonance here. Maybe we should be figuring this out, just using these parties as a foil, dumping, kind of continuing this whole idea of laziness in a different way. It's clearly your fault, the voters. Yeah, for sure. There is definitely a subset of people who are just downright racist and do not like people who are not like them. Absolutely, there are those kinds of people. That's not enough to really see the kinds of numbers either in polling data or in actual voting results. The number of people who are just outright racists and you can't change their minds, that's not enough. That will maybe get you to 5%, maybe 10%, exactly. But it's not enough to get you into power.
Right. So this is precisely my point. Yeah, precisely my point. There is really just one single key to this. You call people a basket of deplorables in whatever version of deplorable, sort of lazy, stupid, unproductive, not enlightened enough, not woke enough,
cosmopolitan enough.
Not cosmopolitan enough, exactly. At your own risk. Your own risk. You're essentially, they are telling you with incredible clarity what are their pains. And essentially you're saying, screw you, not my problem. Get on with the program. We're talking about prepositions. We're talking about pronouns.
It's just amazing to me how much of an empirical failure austerity is and has been. And it is still a politically salient and winnable issue. We see that in Germany with the FDP being in power, the Free Democrats running the finance ministry, slashing the German budget. I think it's really funny when, we hear, especially in Germany, about, die fette Jahre sind vorbei, the good years are over. It's like, when were there good years? When did Germany spend money? This idea that there was some kind of past where Germany, the recent past anyway, where Germany spent a lot of money lavishly on its infrastructure. That was never the case. And now we're being sold this narrative that those lavish times need to be over. We have to start, tightening our belt. When was Germany's belt ever loose? And I really fear the upcoming budget cuts from health, family, infrastructure. Whether you're into climate change or not, maybe you just like to take trains for other reasons. You don't just have to be a do-gooder, tree hugging environmentalist to like trains. Cutting, or at least in terms of, at least when accounting for inflation, cutting the budget for train infrastructure, other kinds of things like this. It really makes me wonder just as we saw a decade ago what the impacts are now, what the impacts now will be a decade from now.
I mean, I think that we know what's coming with it because, I mean, and people should be particularly concerned because a politically unstable Germany, I think it's really quite literally the very last thing that anybody should want.
There's still plenty more to discuss, but everything that happened this week will be developing next week.
I'm sure we're still going to be talking about the far right, but I think that during the summer we also need to talk about the European coast and the 50-degree super tanning machine that Europe has become.
Yeah, I'm staying in Berlin for the summer, where it's only 28 degrees as opposed to what it should be, and not 35 or 40. At least not yet.
At least not yet. At least not yet. Indeed.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Euroscopic Podcast Brief. You can get it anywhere your ears go for podcasts. And if you want more, you can subscribe at our Substack, euroscopic.substack.com. We'll catch you there soon.